Of all the states, why does New York have such terrible election laws? State Senator Zellnor Myrie is here to answer that question and discuss. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Mark Elias. Let's get started. Senator Zellnor Myrie, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Great to be with you, Mark.
So I want to start with what may be an obvious question, but I'll ask it anyway. You are a state senator in Brooklyn, but before that, you were a lawyer at a big law firm in New York City. What made you decide that you wanted to get into politics?
You know, it's appropriate for me to be on this podcast. One of the first pro bono assignments that I had as an associate at the law firm was election protection. That's what I did in the 2016 election. And I remember leaving that night after fielding dozens of phone calls from around the country of people that needed assistance and seeing what the results were going to be. And on my way back home to Brooklyn, despondent about what the future of the country held, but more concerned about what the future of my neighborhood was going to be. And for too long in Albany, there had been inaction on the issues that matter most to the people that raised me in central Brooklyn, whether that was affordable housing, whether that was gun safety, or whether that was access to our democracy. You know, oftentimes people think that is a problem that is relegated to the South or to Republican dominated states. But we had issues here in New York that needed to be addressed on the state level. And as the son of two Costa Rican immigrants who came to this country, worked in factories in Brooklyn when they got here, my dad became a public school teacher, my mom a nurse and small business owner, I knew very well that without the investments, without the prioritization of things that matter to this community, that we were going to be in a bad place. So I stepped up. I ran for state senate in 2018. At the time, we had Republicans controlling the state senate, even though they were in the numerical minority. And I was really grateful that my community supported me. And since we've gotten to Albany, we've addressed many of those issues that I mentioned at the top. And I'm really excited about some of the next steps that we have ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things that you have become known for, and really for people who are not familiar with your work, I would say that you are as well known for champion voting rights as really any state legislator in the country. I mean, in any state, but certainly in New York, you are the most prominent. But you're among the most prominent anywhere in really taking on, what is a less than ideal voting situation. I will tell you, I was born and raised in New York, so I'm a native New Yorker myself. So I'm not criticizing a state I don't have ties to, but I suspect that when you came to the legislature, tackling voting rights was probably not making you very popular, because it seems like Albany quite liked the rules as they were.
They sure did. And if you think about even the construction of the elections committee, so I've had the honor of chairing the elections committee for the past 6 years. And you look at basic functioning of government on how many meetings the election committee held under Republican control. We exceeded that amount in the first year that I was there. And Republicans had held control for the better part of 2 decades in Albany. So I'm really proud of the work that we've been able to do. We've made close to 120 changes to the election law as my time as chair. And I think it was important for us to get to work immediately because there were some obvious things that New York was lagging behind in from the rest of the country. The very first bill that we passed as a conference, as a Democratic majority, was early voting. We were the 39th state to pass early voting. And I think that would come to a surprise of many New Yorkers who are now used to early voting, who are accustomed to it. It's really a proud thing for me. I go early voting with my mom every single election. And we do it at a time that is convenient for both of us. And that is what seems like an innocuous and basic thing, but emblematic of some of the things that we had not been doing for too long in this state. We had allowed on the campaign finance side for LLCs to contribute an unlimited amount to campaigns, and we had to close that loophole in our first year. And who would have known that in 2019 we were on the precipice of a once-in-a-century pandemic? one that would necessitate easing access to the ballot. We saw the increase of absentee ballots being used, and we started that work in 2019 just for basic access to our democracy. And we have seen the usage, we have seen the ease and efficiency of that really shine through. At the end of my first year in the state Senate, we did a hearing to examine how early voting felt, what was the effect, what could we improve. And one of the participants, a witness, talked about how early voting sites were moved at the last minute in certain counties in New York. And we talked about how we used to have protection. We used to have a National Voting Rights Act, a federal one, that would prevent certain measures like that. But we did not have one on the state level. And that was the impetus for me to introduce the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York, that I'm sure we'll get to talk about a little later in the podcast.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about it. I want to ask you, though, sort of a follow up to your work as a legislator, right? Because you are both a democracy advocate, you are also an advocate for affordable housing, you're an advocate for solving the crisis of gun violence. And, I think for people in the audience who don't know how legislators spend their time, how do you see these issues as separate? Do you see the voting issues as integral to the work you do around housing or some of the other issues? Like, do you split your time? Like, how do you balance all of those things?
Well, Mark, and you know this, your listeners know this. Our rights to vote, the franchise, our constitutional right, that is the guardian of all other rights. That allows us to choose our leaders, choose the individuals that we want to make policy for us. So it is intrinsically tied into everything else that I do, which is why I'm so proud of the work we've been able to do on that committee. But my responsibility as a leader in government is to respond to my community. So when people ask me, well, why do you care about gun violence? Why do you care about affordable housing? Because my constituents care about that. That is what they talk to me about when they see me on the train, when they see me walking in the street. They want to know what we are doing, what solutions we're presenting to the problems. And as a legislator, I have taken it seriously to provide legislation to address a lot of these issues. And so when you talk about gun violence, for instance, I passed a first in the nation law to hold bad actors in the gun industry accountable for the violence that was happening on our streets. There was a federal law that protected the industry that was signed by a Republican majority in Congress, signed into law by then President George W. Bush, and it prevented many victims and survivors of gun violence from having justice in court when they were victim to some of these instances of violence. People told us we couldn't get it done. They said no other state in the country has done this. And I said, well, my constituents are demanding this type of justice and this type of public safety. And we got that signed into law in 2021. Mark, as it stands right now, 3 years later, there are 10 other states that have that law on the books. We're talking about close to 35 million Americans that now have an access to justice because we stood up for something that my community cared about. It's the same thing that same approach that we took with the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York. In the absence of federal action on this, we said we have to step up right here in New York. And I'm proud to say that we not only got that signed into law, but we've seen other states now adopt similar voting rights legislation. And that to me is what leadership is about. It's about responding to the community, and it's why we're considering taking another step in our leadership because I think it's important to listen to the folks on the ground.
Yeah, so I want to turn to the some of the legislative successes that you've had, because you've had a number, and you mentioned a couple of times the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, and just so that people in the audience have sort of a level set, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, was what Ronald Reagan, of all people, called the crown jewel of American democracy, passed the U.S. House and Senate, signed by Republican presidents over and over again. In 2006, it was reauthorized 98-0 in the Senate, with only 33 dissenting no votes in the U.S. House of Representatives, championed by Walmart and the Business Roundtable. It was very much a pro-democracy rally. Everyone sort of saw this as good government. In 2013, the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder struck down a key provision of that law, the so-called pre-clearance provision, Section 5. It has also done cutbacks in various cases to some of the other provisions of the law. And Congress, which had a chance to try to fix this, was unable to. There was a John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act at the federal level that got every House Democrat voted for, every House Republican voted against, went to the Senate. It died in the face of Republican opposition to the filibuster. There were several other voting rights bills that also were moving in Congress at the same time. The Freedom of the Vote Act, the For the People Act, all faced essentially the same outcome of Democrat support in the House. And Republican opposition in the Senate, and the filibuster killed it. So with that as the playing field, rather than give up, rather than say, okay, well, I guess there's nothing we can do, you rolled up your sleeves.
And we said we have to take action. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It is a full contact sport. It requires us to engage. And even when it seems scary and daunting, and there are folks that are politicizing what used to be, as you referenced, Mark, a bipartisan agreement on the rules of the game, when in the face of that opposition, it was important for me and my colleagues to do something about it right here in New York. And so we drafted this bill. We worked with many voting rights organizations. We worked with constituents from all over the state of New York. And we introduced this bill. We held a hearing on it, and we eventually got this passed. And as you referenced, part of the crown jewel, what has often been called the strongest piece of civil rights legislation in this country's history, we saw, as you mentioned, right after that passage, Black voter registration went up precipitously, unlike anything that we have seen in the country since. And it was met, of course, by retrenchment and opposition. And that is the period that we are in right now. And so what we did here in New York was we made a state level pre-clearance, empowering who I believe is the best attorney general in the country, Attorney General Tish James, but empowering that office to pre-clear any changes to the rules or procedures that might threaten vulnerable voters. And this is not something that is just on paper. We have, in fact, right now, active lawsuits that are being litigated using this law, one in particular by Latino voters in Westchester who have never seen representation that looks like them in their history of the town. So that is work that is so important because it's not just in Westchester, but we have stuff in Long Island and even in the great city of New York, where we've seen purges of the voter rolls, where we've seen some intransigence in the administration of our elections. It was important for us to give the state the tools to empower, to increase access, and I think time will prove that this was a worthy effort for us to do at this time.
Oh, it's a historic effort, and like I said, you were a leader in this. You also, by the way, um, enacted a law that made ballot curing easier. And I've talked about this. It is a tragedy of American democracy how many lawful votes get thrown out. Frankly, not due to the fault of the voter, just due to the fact that election officials don't think a signature matched, or they think something's wrong that isn't. And this is typically with mail-in voting, and it is dispiriting for voters to learn that they went through all the trouble to vote and then found out their ballot in the end didn't count. So it is important that they're given an opportunity to cure or address or fix any problems that the election officials may think. So tell people about what you did here and how important it's been.
Imagine this, Mark. You are a voter. We are in the height of a once in a century pandemic, but you want to exercise your right to vote. You want to engage in your democracy. And so you say, I'm going to fill out this absentee ballot, even though I've never used this process before. It's still very important for me to engage. So I'm going to fill out the absentee ballot. But I left a little stray pen mark on the ballot, or maybe I was having a slice of pizza and I got a little bit of oil, and you submit the ballot, you think you participated, only to find out that your vote never counted. And no one has told you that your vote didn't count. So you are operating in ignorance, not through any fault of your own, but just because the system was so antiquated. So we passed a bill that said the Board of Elections has to notify you if your ballot has some malfunction or if there's some deficiency in it that will prevent it from being counted. And then they also have to give you time to cure that. And we saw people utilize that after the passage of this law to the tune of tens of thousands. And for too long, those votes have been discarded, and particularly for our older adults. Who sometimes struggle with this, as all of us, God willing, will ultimately get to that age. We sometimes we're not as steady with our hands, or we make some other fault. They should not have their constitutional rights stripped from them because of this mistake. So this is another accomplishment in the legislature that I'm really proud of, because now voters are used to getting this notification. They are utilizing the ability to cure, and it is a direct practical implication of what we have done in the legislature.
We'll be right back with more of my discussion with New York State Senator Zellnor Myrie. But in the meantime, make sure you are subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletter. And if you want to have access to my insights and analysis, become a Democracy Docket member now by clicking on the link above. Yeah, and look, I could go on and on about your accomplishments. You passed a very important redistricting law that I care a lot about, having to do with where legal challenges are brought. But I want to turn to, because you've alluded several times, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on. You've alluded several times to an antiquated system, system where the election officials or the election administrators have not always been as helpful or as forward-looking as they should. One of the things that where you did not succeed in passing legislation is something near and dear to my heart. I've been representing, my firm's been representing the NAACP of Brooklyn to strike down a ban on line warming, basically handing out food and water to people waiting in long lines. This has had tragic consequences around the country for particularly Black voters who tend to wait in the longest lines. That's, I sometimes cite statistics from Georgia, where in the 6 metro counties, if you were in a precinct and that was 90% or more registered Black voters, you waited in line an average of 51 minutes. If you were in the same 6 counties, so apples to apples, and you were in a precinct that was 90% or more white, you waited in line an average of 6 minutes. 51 versus 6 minutes explains why Georgia banned food and water in line. I'm not saying that New York passed this law to be racially discriminatory, because it's a very old law, but it did have racially discriminatory effects. It disproportionately negatively impacted communities of color and young voters. And you proposed a very sensible bill after we had filed our lawsuit. After the state board of elections and the city board of elections were fighting that lawsuit. I mean, I could ask the question of why the hell they were fighting the lawsuit. But you proposed a very sensible bill that would sort of do away with this antiquated thing. You didn't point fingers. You didn't say, you're bad people for having this. You tried to get a practical solution, and it didn't pass. And I'm just curious, what is the dynamic that goes on, that there is resistance among some to making improvements, as you say, practical improvements that make the quality of life for voters better?
Mark, it's one of the more troubling things about doing work in the state capitol. One, because it's often hard to explain to people who were not in the weeds and who don't follow Albany politics why we have certain outcomes. But I think if you think about some of what you've referenced earlier, this used to be an issue that had bipartisan support. Increasing access to the franchise, allowing for people to participate. Sure, we're on different teams in a particular election race, but there was some agreement on what the rules would be. But because of what we have seen across the country, the polarization and the over politicking of our elections, we've seen retrenchment and people going to their corners reflexively, not thinking about the substance of the bill, but automatically assuming that there is some nefarious intention. All we wanted to do was strike an antiquated sentence from our statutes. It's not a long bill, it's a 1-page bill, to say it is okay for people to get some water, maybe a granola bar, whatever it is that you like on the line, while you wait. Now, we also must address why there are long lines, and there should not be long lines. It should not be a test of your endurance when you go to vote. That's part of why we passed early voting. That's part of why we held hearings all across the state to talk about the administration of our elections to ensure that they're being as smooth and efficient as possible. But if there are long lines, we simply do not want to ban people from trying to have folks not pass out. We're experiencing record heat just this week here in New York City, and it just doesn't make sense. But I think that there is a built in intransigence when it comes to changes to the election law now because of the politics. And look, there are people that literally stormed our nation's capital over an election. There was an insurrection. And since then, there has been what I like to reference as a slow burn insurrection, where there has been a methodical opposition to anything that will increase access to the franchise. So it makes those of us who care about our democracy, those of us who want to champion our democracy, it is an obligation for us to use every tool at our disposal to help combat that opposition. I'm proud that we've been able to do some of that. Our bill on line warming passed in the Senate, did not make it through in the Assembly. My hope is that we'll have the opportunity to get that again, certainly now that the courts have spoken in the next legislative session.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. So, we sued on behalf of the Brooklyn NAACP. We won. I certainly hope the city and state of New York are not going to appeal, but we will see. But it would be great to see a legislative fix. Like the best outcome is always when legislatures fix these things rather than relying on the courts. You mentioned something that I think is really not intuitive to people who are not familiar with the New York state legislature. So I was aware, because I am somewhat of a junkie about New York, that that there was, and in fact you alluded to it in your first election, there was a sort of renegade group of independent Democrats, which were not really Democrats. They were sort of gumming up the works. You beat one of them in your first race. And now Democrats are in charge. And it really, it hasn't occurred to me, but I'm going to ask you, so has MAGA extremism come to New York? Like, when you think of Republicans in New York, honestly, I assume that they are sort of moderate, New York, you know, uh, suburban moderates. But are you saying that that is not the case in Albany?
That is not the case. And, even the term Rockefeller Republican, which of course has New York roots, I think people used to take harbor in that and say, well, Republicans here aren't as strident and extreme as those we see around the country. But that's not the case anymore. We put on the ballot same day registration to allow for more people to participate, no excuse absentee balloting, to remove the requirement that you had to provide an excuse to vote by absentee. This was temporarily put in place during the pandemic. We were looking to get it added to the Constitution. And the Republicans spent a lot of money in opposition of this. And they used extreme language to say that this would cause chaos to our democracy. This would allow for undocumented individuals to vote. They used all of the tropes and the fear mongering that we have heard across the country. And guess what? They were successful. They defeated those ballot initiatives, and so MAGA Republican theory language still very much alive here in the state of New York, and that's why we take this so seriously. Every time someone says, "Z, this is New York. This is New York. Come on, we don't have to really, champion democracy." I say, absolutely not. They are taking us to court. They're using every tool possible. We still have right now people trying to move early voting polling sites. The attorney general had to sue a county in order to stop them from moving these polling sites. They're using every trick in the book, and we have to remain just as resilient, and we have to pay attention because it's happening in our own backyard.
Yeah, you mentioned this, that the Republicans are actually suing New York to make voting harder. I mean, it's one thing. I find this extraordinary, because it's one thing to say, okay, look, we're not going to make voting easier. Okay, we're not going to participate in making voting easier in legislative process, but to literally spend money to hire lawyers to target a mail-in voting law that, if you don't want to vote by mail, don't vote by mail. But for the people who vote by mail, they really like it. Like, it's very popular. And for Republicans to be wasting their time and spending their money doing this, I mean, do you have any insight into why they are so focused on this?
I think a charitable interpretation would say that they're worried that in some instances, Democrats utilize these methods more than Republicans. But if that's really the motivation, just talk to your Republicans. Tell them to use it, utilize it. This isn't a method that is available on a partisan basis. This is available for any eligible voter to utilize. And what they are experiencing is in the past, they have been in such steep opposition to these methods. And they have talked to their base and communicated that they did not or should not be utilizing this. And when other constituencies used it, and used it to success. And as you said, once you do it, you want to do it more. They did not pivot and say, well, we should be utilizing this as well. It's really important for me to underscore this point. Voting rights should not be a partisan issue. We have many other arenas where we can battle out on a partisan basis. We should be battling on our ideas for how we make our communities safer, more affordable, more livable. Those are things that we have different worldviews on, and that's okay. That is part of the process. But the rules of the game, we all should agree on what the rules of the game should be. And if we want more people to participate, that should not be a threat to you. That should encourage you to do more voter education and try to convince folks on your ideas.
Yeah, I say this all the time to folks. If you looked at what voting by mail looked like, before Donald Trump, um, it either had a neutral political bias or maybe in some places a slight Republican bias. Florida Republicans will tell you they took control of the Florida government based on mail-in voting. Going back to more than a decade, but when Colorado first adopted vote by mail, universal vote by mail, a Democratic senator lost their election. Mark Udall lost his election. This was not a partisan. This didn't have there's no natural reason to think Democrats prefer to vote by mail versus Republicans. In fact, there was a lot of thought, in the sort of 2016, 2018 timeframe. You know what? A lot of Black voters in particular like to vote early in person. Older voters tend to vote by mail, and oftentimes younger voters are more Democratic, older voters are more Republican. There was a lot of mixed feelings about what the effect of increased vote by mail was, but Democrats were like, look, it's something constituents want. It is something that saves money, right? Because you don't need to close all the schools and buy more voting equipment, right? It's literally convenience for constituents. It's something politicians love because it's something they could deliver that made quality of life better. And then Donald Trump all of a sudden decided to declare war on voting by mail, and now you see all of these Republicans at the state level parroting it, even though, like you said, all they'd have to do is say, hey, if you live in rural upstate New York, do I have something for you in the winter? I got something that'll let you not worry about driving to the polling places.
It's exactly right. And that's a really good point, Mark. You think about some of our more rural areas where, by the way, Republicans tend to win elections, where the voting by mail would be much easier. It would make it more accessible, and they would have more opportunities to participate. So it's really a baffling approach, and one that I think ultimately they're going to regret. I think it's really important. I am confident enough in our ideas. I'm confident enough in our record to say we should all play by the same rules. Let's get as many people in the game as possible because I want to duke it out on the field. I don't want to work the refs. Let's actually make this happen. Let's have a competition of policies and ideas and not try to rig the game. And I think it's just really an unfortunate effort by the Republicans. And my hope is that some of my friends on the other side of the aisle will see the light.
Look, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on this podcast, and one of the reasons why I am so impressed and excited to talk to you, is that for those of us who are fighting Republican states, for those of us who are in court every day fighting the Georgias, the Texases against their voting laws, it is one of the things that they point to is they'll say, well, look at the blue states. And, you are a rare elected official who got elected under a series of election laws that you want to change, right? You got elected under a series of laws where your voters know how to vote and you want to expand the electorate. And you're not afraid to say, we can do more. And that is so extraordinary. One of the things that every time I talk to a Democratic governor or a Democratic AG or a Secretary of State where they control elections or state legislators, and they say, well, we passed a big voting bill. We passed, in your case, the voting rights, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. And then they feel like they're done. And what's great about you is that you understand that democracy can always be made better. You can always improve on voting. And that's what I love about I literally follow the legislation you introduce. I have someone who keeps a tracker for me in various states, and I track what you introduce because you're always looking to improve. You're not like defensive about it, like, hey, we're New York, we've got it solved, which, by the way, I get a lot of in a lot of blue states. You are always pushing to make voting better for everyone, whether they voted for you or didn't vote for you. And that is such a rare thing for an elected official.
Well, Mark, our democracy is not static. It is by function. It happens all the time. We are voting all the time. So there's no way that we should not be also making adjustments all the time to make it better. It's frustrating because I think there is a legislative amnesia when it comes to our democracy. We did not always have access to the ballot, and particularly for Black voters, for voters of color. Someone had to have the vision, someone had to have the skill and the discipline to say, we have to work at this consistently. One day, we will all have the access that we need. One day, we will remove the obstacles to our franchise. So I'm standing on the shoulders of many people who did not get to live to see early voting, who did not get to see a state voting rights act, who did not get to see us fight for our young people to participate in our democracy. So I feel an obligation, Mark, to be a legislator of vision, to think about how things can be better. And there is always room for us to improve. We passed a law here in New York that allows for pre-registration. That is, 16 and 17-year-olds can pre-register to vote such that when they turn 18, they are automatically registered. I'm really proud that we were able to pass that. But guess what? There aren't mechanisms in our schools to help with this pre-registration. We should be in every school in New York City and throughout the state. There should be a democracy officer, someone that is just focused on this. Let's pre-register all our juniors. Let's pre-register all our seniors. And we know that when young people vote young, they remain engaged voters for the rest of their lives. This is the future of our democracy. This is why the work never ceases. And this is why I'm really excited to continue to push for reforms.
Well, that's amazing, and that's a great idea. I love that idea. Pre-registration exists in other states, but the idea of having someone in schools whose job it is to make sure, that is a really good idea, and that's one you guys should pass, and you should spread that around the country. I can't let you go without asking you at least one political question. I know you set up an exploratory committee to run for the mayor of New York City. And that is a big undertaking. New York City is a big and diverse and wonderful place. As someone who grew up around New York City, tell me about that. And do you see voting and democracy again? As you look at the issue set facing New Yorkers, people in New York City, The rest of the state hates when you call New York City people New Yorkers. When you look at people, citizens of New York City, do you see this in the issue set of other things that they are concerned about?
Yeah, Mark, I would not be who I am today without the city of New York. And as I mentioned, this is where my parents came because they wanted an opportunity. They wanted to raise their family in a safe environment. They wanted to work hard and send me to good schools. And that is why they came to Central Brooklyn from Costa Rica close to 50 years ago. I will start where I left off on pre registration. The ability to create a democracy officer in every school in New York City, that is something that we could do from City Hall. That is something that requires vision and a handle of the nuts and bolts of government to get done. I want to see universal after school. I am a product of after school programming. If not for that, I might have taken a different path in life. And every working family in this city should have that opportunity. But for too many New Yorkers, that same promise that brought my parents to this city is out of reach. I just got married last November, which is one of the best things that has ever happened to me. My wife and I, who also was born and raised in Central Brooklyn, we can barely afford a home in this district. When we think about trying to expand our family, the average cost of childcare in this city is close to $25,000. When we think about our subway system, when we think about our streets, these are things that require livability and a relentless focus on making the city more affordable and having a true handle on the nuts and bolts of government. So that's why we've put our hat in the ring. That's why we are exploring this option. I believe democracy is central to the running of government. More mechanically, the mayor appoints the administrators to the boards of elections. The mayor does have some say in how the elections are run in the city of New York. So I think we have to have it grounded in making the democracy as accessible as possible, trying to get as many young people involved in this process. And really serving as a source of inspiration for why it's important to engage with your government. I'm proud of the work that we've done in the legislature. We've demonstrated focus. We've demonstrated relentless support for affordability, for gun safety, for housing. And I think that we can bring that same type of focus to City Hall. And I would love the opportunity to do that for the city that has made me who I am today.
Well, like I said, there is no stronger supporter of democracy, and not just in words, but in actions, not just in actions that you achieve, but in actions that you want to achieve. Like I said, it is not enough for elected officials to say, well, we passed one bill, so I check that box and now I move on. You are day in and day out finding ways to improve the voting experience and the elections and democracy for all New Yorkers, not just in your district, not just in New York City, but an important point you made, in redder parts of the state, they are benefiting as well. And so that is a very, very unique quality, and I applaud you for that. And I will be following to see whether you announce that you run for mayor, and if so, I'd love to have you back on to talk about some of the ideas you have for New York around democracy. Because, by the way, your idea is a brilliant. I mean, the idea of a democracy officer at every school gets me really excited here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity, Mark, and I would encourage listeners who are curious about what our vision for the city is to visit our website. That's zellnor.nyc, ZELLNOR.NYC. And if we have news to break, Mark, we will be back on the podcast if you'd be gracious enough to have us.
You got it, and we will put a link to that as well as everything else that we've talked about, the bills and other things in the show notes as well. Thank you, Zellnor Myrie, for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Defending Democracy. To find out more and stay up to date on the latest voting rights and election news, visit democracydocket.com and make sure you are subscribed to our daily and weekly newsletters. We'll see you next time